Hey everyone, this is Jordan from Sleeklens.com, and in this podcast we're going to go over drone photography and drone flying tips. The reason I decided to do this particular podcast is because it's obviously getting around the holiday season here and the Christmas season, and a lot of people might be getting into drones. I think drones are becoming a very popular thing. They've been out for a long, long time. But it's starting to look like that a lot of people are getting drones in hopes of kind of furthering their photography experience. I know personally when I got my drone, I use it for real estate photography. I know when I got that drone, I was so excited because as soon as I flew it up in the sky and started seeing the photos that I could capture, not just real estate stuff, but I would see the landscapes that I could capture. It just opened my eyes to all kinds of different possibilities when it comes to drones. So I have a couple flying tips and a couple camera tips in case you might be getting a drone for the holiday season. So let's go and start off with pretty much the simple tips when it comes to flying the drone. Okay, so the first tip we're going to talk about is staying in the beginner mode when you start. A lot of the popular drones out there have what's called beginner mode, and it kind of differs depending on what model that you have. But what it basically does is it only limits you from going a certain height and a certain amount of distance away from you. So you can probably only go maybe 100 feet up in the air, 50 feet up in the air, and you can probably only go about maybe 300 or 200 feet away from you in any direction. This is a very helpful thing when you first get started, because what that does is allow you to get to know the drone. Obviously, when you fly your first flight, you don't want to be taking off and getting it, 1,500 feet away from you where you can't even see it. You're not sure where the buttons are, and all that fun stuff, because you will eventually lose it if you do it that way. So the beginner mode is a really, really cool feature where you can just practice flying it around your really, really small area and get to know the controls, get to know the camera controls, get to know how fast the thing can go, get to know the speed, the acceleration of maybe going up and down. It's just a really good mode. I personally, when I got mine, I probably stayed in the beginner mode for probably my first 5 or 6 flights. And that was just going to just a place where I could fly it around. And that got me really, really used to the controls. And that does help out when you take it off the beginner mode and you're able to fly farther away and higher up. That does help you a lot because you're more comfortable with the controls. So being comfortable is very, very important when flying a very expensive piece of machinery, because you want to make sure you can actually bring it home at the end of the day. So next, to kind of piggyback off of the beginner mode is actually when you first do your first flight, make sure you do it in a really open setting, an open field of some sort. This is a really common sense thing, but a lot of people don't do it. They'll get their drone, run out in their backyard, and they're over a residential area, and they'll start flying it around, and it can end up to be something very negative. Maybe you're not used to flying it, and you ram it into a house or something like that. Not only will you damage your drone, you could possibly damage the home. So being in a really open field, open area is kind of a beginner thing. A lot of people don't do it again, but it's a common sense thing that it should happen that way. You're not going to run into anything except the ground. So if you happen to do that, it's going to be your fault, but at least you won't hurt anything else and be liable for any other situation. Next, we have paying attention to the wind. Again, this is another obvious thing, but these days a lot of drones can actually handle a fair amount of wind. If you're flying it out there and you have maybe 10 mile an hour wind gust, depending on the drone, most likely it will be able to handle that. It's not going to blow it away or anything like that. So paying attention to the wind is a very, very important thing. But when you're looking at the wind, don't just pay attention to the actual wind speed. Pay attention to the wind gusts. Because, you could have 10 mile an hour wind, but you could have higher wind gusts, and that could be a potential thing, especially if you're flying at higher altitudes. So pay attention to the wind gusts. The topic of the week, the feature of the week for this week is actually going to be an iPhone app that can help you with that, and I'll go over that later in the episode. But again, paying attention to the wind, and especially the wind gusts, is a very, very important thing. Okay, so now what I'm going to talk about is actually a little side technique, which is called mastering the figure 8. What that means is sort of well known, I guess. It's a technique of flying your drone in the shape of an 8. So you're flying it kind of in big loops. And the mastering the figure 8 is kind of a thing that allows you to get more used to the controls, because if you're flying the drone away from you, it's fairly easy because left is left and right is right. But if you're flying it back towards you, right is left and right and left is right. So the controls are flopped that way. They're different directions. So it can be really hard to think about that depending on how your drone is flying. So if you fly your drone in a figure 8 pattern right in front of you, that'll get you kind of more used to controls. So when you're flying away, you can press right and it'll go right, and you can loop back left. But then as soon as you get to where the drone's facing you, that's when you have to kind of reverse your directions and start thinking about it. So all it does is just kind of make you think when the directionals are going to be different. So that's what I call mastering the figure 8. Once you can kind of get that really tight figure 8 pattern, then you're pretty much used to the controls and you kind of understand the directionals. Okay, so now let's talk about landing and takeoff. When it comes to taking off, most drones are super, super easy to take off. Some of them even have, if you were to plug your drone into your phone to see that's your monitor. If you plug it in there, there's a takeoff button. You can click that. Your drone will fire up the propellers and lift itself off and probably get around 4 or 5 feet, and it'll kind of hover there until you tell it to go anywhere else. So takeoff is super easy. Even if you don't do it through the phone or the control, the monitor, it's still fairly easy. Landing can be the hard part. A lot of people think that landing's pretty easy. You just drop it down, hit the floor, and you're good. But it can be actually very, very difficult because depending on how the speed is, it could take you 5 minutes to land your drone because you're going so slow and you don't want to smack the ground. But then some people like to stop the drone propellers or stop the motor maybe a foot above the ground, and that can be damaging, especially if you have a camera underneath. So practicing the landing is also something very important. When I can certainly land my drone, but a lot of times when I'm kind of, depending on the situation, my surroundings, what I like to do is actually catch the drone out of the air and then turn off the propellers. And the reason I do that is because sometimes I'm in like a residential setting where I'm taking photos of a building or something like that, and there might be tall grass or there might be cars in the area or something like that. I'd just rather just catch it out of the air with my hand and then shut off the propellers. That's one thing that I like to do. But obviously, certainly landing it is a very important thing, especially if you're in an open area. There's no reason to catch it. Just go ahead and land it and start mastering that. Okay, now let's talk about GPS. GPS is a very popular thing that's built into a lot of drones these days. And basically what GPS allows you to do is it connects to all the GPS satellites that are orbiting the Earth, and it kind of tells your drone exactly where it is. And if you kind of have the hover setting on your drone, what it can do is just hover in one specific spot. So you can let go of the controls and you don't have to touch anything, and it'll pretty much stay in one spot. If you don't have GPS turned on, then that's when something that you might have to pay attention to the wind or something like that, because wind can actually push your drone away from you if you're not paying attention. So when at all possible, especially if you're just doing something simple like maybe taking a photo of some sort of landscape, you might want to keep GPS on because you can really dial in that composition when you're trying to take a photo, and it'll pretty much hover where it is. Again, if you turn it on some other mode, like an attitude mode or a program mode or something like that, if you turn it on something like that, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, especially in the beginning, because it will want to drift. So GPS mode pretty much prevents it from drifting. And the last tip I'm going to talk about when it comes to actually flying the drone is some basic things that a lot of people know, but they don't actually pay attention to it. And this is where a lot of people get in trouble with drones. So here in the US, at least, there are certain regulations that you have to stick to. The main two actually the main three. The first one is line of sight. Always make sure you can actually see your drone. That's very hard to do, especially because the thing is so small and so small in the sky, and you know if you fly it 800 feet away from you, which is actually legal. If you fly to 800 feet away from you, it's pretty difficult to see. You might be able to see it. See a little speck in the sky. But definitely try to get to that line of sight so you can still see it. Another one is also do not fly above 400 feet. 400 feet is usually like the minimum, or the maximum, actually, the maximum altitude for a lot of drone flights. That just stops it from getting into any other sort of commercial or private airspace. So 400 feet is pretty much the max. There are a lot of drone software that you can actually set the max altitude. So if you attempt to fly above 400 feet, it'll stop. The drone will just stop and won't go any higher. And also the next one is try to stay at least 5 miles away from any type of airport. And I don't just mean like a huge international airport of any kind, but there are sometimes when maybe there's a small municipal airport where maybe only small planes take out of. You need to stay away from those as well. Maybe there's some unpaved airports out there where there might be crop planes. It's really difficult to stay away from those because they could be everywhere. But try to look on the map and see where there might be an airport near you, and just try to stay away from that as much as possible. Okay, so now let's get into some camera tips when it comes to using your drone. Obviously, cameras are really awesome to have on drones because you can really get some awesome shots, some unique perspectives. But the first one, especially in the beginning, is try the automatic mode. So a lot of drones out there you can actually dial in your shutter speed, you can dial in an aperture, you can ISO, you can dial in all that manually, or you can have the camera dial it in for you. And in the beginning, I would definitely recommend just paying attention to the automatic mode. Let the camera do everything for you. Let the drone dial in all the settings. And the reason is because, especially in the beginning, you're concentrating on flying the drone and trying to compose a really cool picture. So if you're flying the drone and trying to pay attention to this, you don't want to have to stop the drone, look down at the screen, and start dialing in a bunch of settings. So pay attention to the automatic modes until you get really, really comfortable with it, and then that's when you can start really dialing in the settings, especially the ISO. That's a big one, because the ISO on a lot of these drones tops out maybe at like 3200 ISO or something like that. And it can really ratchet that up quick. So if you're kind of shooting in sort of a cloudy situation, your ISO will probably be fairly high. So being able to control your own ISO is a really, really useful thing. So on that topic, let's talk about shooting in different conditions. Probably the best conditions to shoot in are, in my experience, would actually be the partly cloudy conditions, because you don't have those really high contrast areas, and those really stand out, especially when you're photographing from above. Sunny, obviously, that's a perfect condition to shoot in. It might not be perfect for the actual result of the photos, because again, very high contrast areas. So I like to try to shoot in partly cloudy situations. Cloudy situations are really difficult to shoot in, not because of the flying conditions, but because you will have a little bit less light hitting your sensor in the drone, and it might be a little bit more noisy in your photos. So another thing to make sure you kind of pay attention to is actually shooting in DNG if possible. A lot of these drones do shoot in JPEG only, but there are some, especially the DJI series, they will allow you to shoot in DNG. So you have that digital negative, gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're editing in Lightroom or Photoshop. Not a whole lot, because the quality of the file is still a little bit lackluster depending on the drone that you have. But you will have a little bit more leeway when you're editing. So if at all possible, shoot in that DNG. If your drone allows it, make sure it'd be nice to shoot in DNG plus JPEG. That'd be good. But just shoot in DNG with all possible. And this last tip I kind of talked about just briefly already. But before committing to any type of shoot with your drone, if you're wanting to do a commercial shoot with your drone, before committing to any shoot, practice and learn the buttons. And I mentioned that before, is, if you're flying your drone and trying to pay attention to not hitting trees or hit any other buildings or anything like that, the last thing you want to do is try to not ram your drone into anything, and also try to figure out where the buttons are to take a photo, or to tilt the camera and all this kind of stuff. So really, really practice. That's what I mean by going to an open field, practicing your drone, not only practicing the flying, but practicing operating the camera as you're flying it. That's a really popular thing, and a lot of people actually don't do it. They just say, hey, I can fly the drone. I can do photos now. So really concentrating, making sure that you have that muscle memory of where all the buttons are and how sensitive they are, especially the panning and tilting of the camera. That's a really important thing to pay attention to. So those are just a few simple tips for flying a drone. If you do happen to get a drone this holiday season, those will really come in handy for you. So I mentioned I had a feature of the week this week, and it has to deal with drones. And the app I want to talk about, and I've talked about this on a couple other episodes, I believe, but it's an app called Hover, so Hover, and it's available for iOS, and I believe it's available for Android as well. And what that allows you to do is to basically, it knows your location through GPS on your phone, and it will automatically look for the weather conditions. It'll give you airports in the area. Maybe it'll give you a notification of that. It'll give you wind gust, all that kind of stuff. It'll give you all of that in a really easy to view window. And at the very top, which is this is the part that I like the best, you don't have to look for anything specific. It just says ready to fly at the top, meaning your location, you're good to fly. There's nothing around you that's going to impede you. And so you're ready to fly. Now, obviously, if you're maybe within 3 miles of an airport or something like that, it'll say caution, and then you can click on that and it'll tell you what the caution is. But for the most part, whenever I go to a location to do a job or something like that, I'll just quickly pull up that app Hover and let it find me and say, and I'll see it says ready to fly, and I'm like, okay, good, I'm good to go. This is built into a lot of different apps as far as like DJI. They will notify you if there's an airport or something like that or high wind. But again, I just like to have that separate app just to make sure. So those are just a few simple tips for flying your drone, especially if you're very, very new to it. And I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. So thank you for joining me in this episode. Remember to visit sleeklens.com for a bunch of cool photography stuff. And remember to rate this episode on iTunes. That would be very helpful to help the show grow just a little bit. It's still fun to do, but we want it to grow just a little bit so we can start getting a bigger community around the podcast. So thank you guys for joining me in this episode, and I'll see you next week.